Yeah, okay. I'm supposed to tell you a little bit more about the background of our event today, how this discussion and the edition on the African feminism across generations evolved. In Nigeria, I don't know whether everybody is aware, especially those ones in Abuja, but also people who are attending here on Zoom. Nowadays, HBS in Nigeria is known mainly for its sustainable development agenda and activities. But actually, hello? Actually, women's rights, gender equity, and gender democracy have always been and are still main pillars of the work of the foundation. And in Nigeria, we started, I think it was in 1995, with a cooperation with women in Nigeria. And by then it was a cooperation of one of the precursors, three precursors of the foundation, which was then the Frauenanstiftung, which later merged into the Heinrich Böll Foundation in 1997. And I joined the foundation here in Nigeria in 1999, and then we started women's rights programs that were working on issues like traditional harmful practices, mainly in the East. Then we had to deal with the introduction of Sharia in the North. We did work on gender budgeting, women in politics, and so on. And I think it was in around 2015 when we stopped with the mainstream gender and women's rights projects and tried to, we rather explored on how to mainstream all our programs, which sounds easy, but it turned out not to be easy. But we worked on issues like increasing participation of women as users and as actors in the renewable energy sector, increasing activities of women farmers and their power in agriculture. I'm, for instance, looking at a project that is called Fair Shared City, which looks at urban planning issues from the perspective of low-income women, or also we look at the use of public spaces. And since beginning of this year with my colleague Shema, we have started a democracy program with a strong component of gender democracy and feminism. So feminist debates have a long tradition in the Heinrich Böll Foundation at local and international level. And in the past few years, the foundation, the international level, defined and institutionalized a long-term international gender strategy, which is called the Compass for Gender, Democracy and Feminism. And an integral part of this strategy are the gender focal points in all the international offices and also in Berlin. And I am still the gender focal point for the Nigerian office, but now gradually handing over to my colleague Shema, which is another intergenerational transition. I was part of the development of this publication that we are launching today, which is a co-production of all African gender focal points with my colleagues from Nairobi, from Dakar, from Cape Town, and Nicola from Berlin. So when we came together, I think it was in 2019, we all agreed, I mean, we looked at cross-cutting issues in our region and our countries, and we all agreed that there's a need to reflect deeper on the gains and challenges of local African feminisms over the past decades, and the obvious need also to bridge a communication gap between feminists and women rights activists of the older generation and the younger ones who still face actually the same or even reinforced patriarchal structures, and they experience the same or even or similar inequities. So the idea was actually born to work together on the African feminism across generations, although the title was not yet there. And around the same time, we have this African regular quarterly African Perspectives publication series, and it was always managed by Now our director, Jochen Luckscheiter, so he left South Africa then and became director in Nigeria. So it was like the series was like an orphan, and we as Gender Focal Points agreed to launch the first edition without Jochen, which was very challenging task. And luckily, I mean, we had really a wonderful editor, who is the well-known South African activist Melanie George. And also our colleague from South Africa, the communications manager, Claudia Lopez. Without her constant gentle reminder and gentle guidance, I think, especially when it came to the last part of the edition, it wouldn't have been possible without both their inputs. So an Africa-wide launch is also planned at a later stage, maybe in a few months' time, and I think you will all get the invitations. And so these contributions, they cover two dimensions. One is time, which covers across the generations, and then the space across Africa. And I want to thank today also Nkoyo and Olutimehin for their very lively and interesting conversation I had with them. And this was the basis for the contribution from Nigeria. And I think the conversation actually ended on a very positive note, because both stressed that more exchange and networking and common identification is necessary. And they were both ready to engage in bridging those gaps. I don't know whether they have been able to come together since then, but anyway, I think we will hear today. And we also have photos from Ayodeji Oshowobi and from Nengi Nelson in our publication. So we also want to thank them. So yeah, from here, I think let's start our discussion on the way forward for Nigerian feminism today. And I hand over to Aritz, wishing all of us a lively and a memorable event. And I'm looking forward to all the discussions.
Thank you so much, Monica. I have to say I really enjoyed reading the interviews and the conversations. They were very insightful. They gave me much to think about. And I'm looking forward to pulling some of that into our conversation this evening. And I'd like to welcome everyone once again to this forum on intergenerational feminism. I'd like to say huge thanks to our online audience who have waited very patiently. And I'm looking forward to someone whose work is very centered around issues that affect women, especially, you know, I don't know if we can say especially violence, but I'll let her tell us what she has. And here I'm very happy to introduce Mariam Bukar Hassan, who's a spoken word poet. She's spoken on different stages, the Ake Arts and Book Festival, TEDx Argungu and TEDx Matala Square, Northern Youth Summit, Next Level USA, the DARE Conference, Humanitarian Remembrance Conference, and the Sustainable Development Goals Conference. As she attended the 8th African Union Summit in Kampala, Uganda, and has been an activist on violence against women and children. She won praise for her video on domestic violence. It's titled Violence Has No Religion, and it's on YouTube, so you should check it out. And in 2017, she released her album titled In the Heart of Silence. I'm looking forward to hearing what she has to say. So can we give a very warm round of applause for Farhan Islam? It's the heart, and I have that when you're talking about feminism, define it in accordance to your reality. Thank you so much for that. So the piece that I have for you today is a poem that talks about the she vices in the north and what I see as a future for the northern Nigerian woman, which is to get to her highest potential, to become a crowning point, and that is the title of my poem. Thank you. Okay, and the title is Crowning Point. The sigh weighed heavy on my breast. Art, I was denied. Became like a diamond in the dirt. I opened up to speak, fit not in the council of men, they said. Self-esteem almost crippled. I was seen as just a girl. I took a book to read, but nay, they gave me twigs to feed. I took a book to read, but nay, they gave me tray to hold. I took a book to read. This is not for you, they said, as though there is no need. Don't strip me of literacy, I pleaded. I felt so confined, but I knew there was more to me than distant faith in me. I had to fight was a battle. To be freed from this shackle, for education, the solution, for the power of expression, I cannot say. So I stood against oppression, saving myself from depression. The arts in me, I express them as books and some as teaching. And now when I stand to speak, they listen. When I pick a book to read, they pay attention. Because now they see art in my passion. I still need and feed, but in fashion. But education did not strip me of my roles, but refinement and liberation. It is in this life, heart, it is in this life, smile. It is the positivity you can feel from the vibe that I fought a lot of battles, yet I still stand for. I believe your gender shouldn't determine your strength, but the ability to pull through a situation either on your knees or face down. Call me the crowning point of the Northern Nigeria. Thank you.
So speaking about marginalization, we then have to talk about how intersectional our feminism conversation is, especially in Nigeria. There are, somebody chuckling. There are conversations around classism, conversations around religion, conversations around sexuality. And you say something to Mayan that for queer feminists, this raises the question, should I dedicate my radical energy to a movement that only wants my womanhood and does not want my queerness? Because I would not, well, you didn't say because, I'm adding that. I would not even be able to rely on the women's rights movement to fight for me the way we've been fighting for women, given that women's rights organizations didn't fight against the act in the way that they usually would with feminist issues. And I think we saw a bit of that with the NSAS protests, where it was all one big happy family. And when queer activists came into the conversation, then it was like, okay, you all need to step aside because we have this bigger issue to fight about. And that conversation and the way the exclusion happened struck me then, and it continues to strike me even till now. Today, I don't know if there is a place for resolution when we have these conversations.
Neither do I.
So how do we think about them?
The answer that I have arrived at in turning this question over, and I'm sure most of the people in the room will be aware the degree to which I've had to turn this question over in recent times, is that prioritize what matters to you. I understand that feminists come from different locations, and some feminists are more precious about their locations than others. And that's okay, because if you're defining feminism according to your reality, then that means that everybody's understanding and practice is personal. So I don't take it personally when people outside of their feminist ideology may or may not see me and my community as human, don't see my ideology as valid. It's like, if you don't respect my existence, you're not going to respect my politics. And so, because I respect my existence, I will prioritize my politics and mobilize with people who share that respect and those priorities. Because ultimately, we're not all going to arrive at the same kind of liberation, but we're all going to arrive at liberation, right? So if we're not working together, we can work alongside one another. We don't have to talk. Till your land, I'll till mine. When the harvest comes and everybody's full. But I mean, it would be nice if people stayed out of one another's way while this was being done. Because I think that's where the friction comes from, where we can respect that feminism is personal when the personal is the thing we recognize and understand and have social scripts for. And then when it's a thing that you're kind of like, what am I looking at? Then it's not allowed, right? So if we're allowed to have personal feminisms, then every personal feminism that is moving towards liberation is legitimate. So if I prioritize the things that matter to me, and you prioritize the things that matter to you, and we stay out of one another's way, or at least, just try not to hurt, try not to hurt one another on the way, we'll get there, and it'll be nice for everybody. So that thing I was saying about no longer expending energy on trying to convert anyone, let everybody focus on their own thing. And the collective result, I think, is beneficial for everyone.
Yes, so Dr. Baragai and Dr. Seliba talk about feminism across generations, and they talk about moving from very radical feminism to a current day, more inclusive feminism. And one of the things that stood out for me was how groups were able to gather, agitate, and collectively push for change. We saw that happen when we were transitioning into the civilian era. And it feels to me like we're most effective in organizing when it was political, when we were fighting against government-named oppressions. How can we take those successes, those lessons that we've learned about creating women's groups, about mobilizing and agitating? These are things that have existed pre-colonial eras. I mean, up FEMCO, but FEMCO for me was one of the most singular examples of that happening. And the fact that they're so noteworthy is because it doesn't seem like there are as many groups. No, not in the civil rights space, but in a space that mobilizes in much the way that was happening in 20 years ago in the 80s and pre the colonial era. You know what I'm asking? What can we do? How can we more effectively mobilize? Or are we mobilizing effectively? I'm asking a hard question. I know.
Look, I think the thing about it is looking at mobilizing and organizing. I think it's quite important to not fall into this monitoring and evaluation framework, which is hard not to do, right? Of saying that, if you now pass a bill, that's when you effectively mobilize, or if you just raise all of this money, that's when you have effectively mobilized. I think for me, NSAS was a time of reflection, because I remember with Choma working with young people to protest. And we had walked, if you know Abuja, we walked from Brega to Union Square. And then when we got to Union Square, people were like, okay, so let's go home. And then the young people were like, oh, sorry. Millennium. Unity Foundation. Thank you. Sorry,
okay.
I went to the US for a week.
Okay.
So Unity Foundation. And then we got there. And then the young people were like, I did not leave my house to come here. We are going to police. And we all and went there. And then when we got there, somebody came down to talk to them, and they wouldn't leave. And I remember talking to someone and saying that if it was us, if I had gone there for maybe, issues around violence or something, somebody would come and talk to us, or give us letter, I'll be like, okay, we're good, let's go. I'm not saying that that wasn't necessarily effective. Sometimes it pushes that agenda. But I think what I'm also just trying to say is that there's different ways of looking and different ways of, ensuring that we don't lose moments and we don't lose what brings people into this conversation and what brings them into being able to understand their power and how they can push agendas. And I think it's quite important to talk about that. But for me, the really big thing is that I have been trying to look for those kind of answers. Because when I'm talking to young women around, say, issues of the gender and equality, or even the sexual harassment in institutions in which they feel so powerless and feel that there's nothing that they can do to be able to, push back against being harassed by their professors or push back against institutions actually holding their harassers accountable. And one of the things that came up for us is that we don't realize that we do not help young people or help children understand the issues of power. We don't. We take it for granted. But we actually really don't talk to them about it. See power imbalances as the issue. They see the issue as, sexual violence or harassment. They don't see the unequal power imbalances that exist. Which now brings me to the issue of saying that we take political education for granted. We do, because one of the things that women in Nigeria was able to do was that kind of political education and those kind of conversations. And but now when we do our work, we don't think we need to invest in that education. We don't think we need to invest in those conversations. We don't think we need to invest in that almost, not necessarily slow burn, but in that build up to understanding what the issues are, what are the root causes, what's going to actually change. Because it's when that happens, we actually see change happen, right? That's when we actually see something come to pass. And we need to be able to invest in that. And I think now within civil society space, because that's where I'm located and that's where I grew up, we call it movement building. I think we take it for granted because honestly, that's what's required. You can't get around it. You just can't. You do have to build movement because even if you're talking about the issue of intersectionality, I meet young people who come into the organization I work with and who never really had a conversation about what it means to be queer, or even to talk about sexual health in general, right? And coming thinking maybe masturbation is a sin. And leave the organization understanding bodily autonomy and being able to talk about it in ways that make sense to their realities, but also really be able to encompass even people they do not know, or the realities of people they do not exist in. So for me, we have to do that work. That investment has to happen, because if it doesn't happen, then the change isn't going to happen.
Can I just add to that really quickly? The point that you made about not having conversations about power, I think is really important, because it's not just young people who don't understand how power informs domination and then scales out to become oppression. It's an astonishing number. It's just like everybody, right? So you meet feminists who recognize patriarchal power when it's coming from the type of person that is safely described as the enemy within patriarchy. So if it's a wealthy man or an abusive husband or a police officer, there are people who come to feminist politics believing that patriarchal power looks like a specific thing, as opposed to the fact that it is a form of relation, a social relation that anybody can embody. So people don't understand, for instance, that beating your children is domestic violence, because you talk about domestic violence and it's a man beating his wife, but you are physically assaulting a person in the context of their home space. By definition, beating your child for whatever reason, you are committing an act of domestic violence. And then people are like, oh no, but how explain? There's a power imbalance there that's being used to dominate, to extract specific results, because the person with the greater power can enforce that. But people don't think of parents as embodying patriarchal power, for instance. Or people don't think of how pastors embody patriarchal power, because these are spaces where when people enter those spaces, they suspend the politics. So if we're not having conversations about patriarchal power as the problem, one, and number two, not transforming our personal relationships to power in our work, we're always going to be here. Because that's the other thing. When I started to question my feminist politics, it was partly because I had encountered too many feminists whose goals were abstract. So we want to end violence against women, and we want to end, we want to equal pay, these things, but they're interactions with the women in their life, in the flesh, on a day-to-day basis, were extremely patriarchal, extremely violent, extremely dehumanizing, extremely counter to the politics that they were espousing in the world. And I'm like, so who is the woman that you imagine is the beneficiary of the work you're trying to do? Because your house help is terrified and she sleeps under the stairs. And your driver, if he fucks up, you will put him in a jail cell. But you're a feminist. So at what point do you begin to interrogate your practice and ask yourself how your belief in the end of patriarchal power actually shows up in the lives of the people over whom you yourself have power? Because in that absence of understanding that power can be embodied by anyone, patriarchal power continues to thrive.
There's one of the conversations in the newsletter is one between Ms. Ramaro and Elspeth Engelbrecht. And she talks about intergenerational feminist organizing and solidarity. And she talks about this, that many of us think of feminism in the context of the work that we do, and not necessarily in the context of our personal lives and existences. And so what happens is that we cannot always identify positive or negative feminist experiences in our person. And we don't always know to identify harm when it's done to us in our work. And that there's a crossing that needs to happen that isn't happening. I'd like somebody to speak on that, either from your experience or something that you think we are not challenging ourselves about. Does anybody have any perspectives? Try me.
Let me just come back to some of what has been said already.
Okay. No, I'm actually going to ask you. I'm coming back to you, but I wanted to expand this conversation because I want to ask if anybody has had any personal reflections on that, in saying, I believe in these things written down in these articles and these documents. In my day-to-day life, am I experiencing either to others or to myself things that I can identify as feminist or non-feminist behavior from people who should know better? Who would like to give me a reflection on that?
Sorry to bring a little fire, right? But even within the women's movement in Nigeria, you have instances of feminists writing journals and saying, don't work with this person. We don't recognize her. And having been in a small-ish position of power myself, I was told about it. And so I reached out to someone who was a little more powerful than I was in that same space. And I said, you cannot let this thing happen. You can't let this thing continue. And she then started to work back from that. And then I was in a collective thing with these feminists. And one of them started saying, we need to uplift women, we need to raise women, we need to hold them by the hand, intergenerational conversations, and all of that, rubbish that's just to say was impossible to live out. And I was looking at her and thinking, what I have seen screenshots of emails you have written about another feminist in this same community who has worked with you, worked for you, slaved as it were, but because she refuses to take a path that you want, per se, and you have access that she doesn't have, you then write an entire email to a bunch of people saying, she's not one of us, remove her, cast her away, etc. And to be fair, I think in my short life within civil society in Nigeria, it's in my short life in society in Nigeria, I have been blessed to have associated with a number of women who, even in my absence, have said, no, just no, it's not like that, she's not like that kind of thing. This couldn't have been her. But I think that some of the greatest harm, even I have experienced, has come from women within civil society. And so when even in the middle of some work we're doing now, and I'm not going to look at Buki or Aisha, But even in the middle of some work we're doing now, there are people who have refused to work with us because of some people. And so you are waiting for us to fail, quite literally. But we are all uplifting women. And so I think my biggest thing, so this is my answer to your question, but my biggest thing from today so far has been what Timeni said, because you know, and I struggle to even speak because sometimes you come across as constantly fighting. Some days you're like, what am I fighting again? Am I fighting the men? Am I fighting patriarchy? Or am I trying to extricate myself from the fight that another one is fighting me for a reason I'm not aware of? So I think for me, it's just, can you, your farm, my farm. To be honest, if I didn't hear anything today, let me go and look for farm too. My farm, your farm, whatever you're doing in your own. As long as you don't die, just do it. And then, but just leave me in my farm and don't try to poison my soil.
I'm going to. No, please hold on. Oh, now you people are now ready to talk.
You brought the fire.
No, I'd like Nkoyo to give us a quick. Can you give us a perspective in 3 minutes, and then Ahan Islam is going to give us her second poem, and then we'll continue. No, please go ahead. Yes.
We mustn't make the now look like it never existed in the past. It's always been like that. When I was recruited, Jibo is a great guy, he's written a lot of our stories. When I was recruited at that meeting wrong, the first people who, when I lost the election after I had won, said to us, oh, you're no longer civil society, you're now toxic to run elections were women in the NGO community. Does that make them non-feminist? Does that mean that there are fundamental problems? The thing is that the space for power, we've been talking about power here, for even those of us who are in the civil society space, is a very small space. So we are fighting over that little space ourselves to be relevant within it. And it's not something that is unique to women alone. In any situation where there's a shrinking of space, that contestation boils up to the top. What I wanted to say, and I think it's important for me to say it at this point, is that what helped us in our era was we have the global conferences that brought those fundamental human rights instruments, the Beijing conferences. So we had some underpinning of belief. I may not believe in somebody's certain values or certain understanding or certain expressions of feminism, but I understood that fundamental rights were universal. That you didn't change because I didn't believe in yours. So the fundamentals were already there. And I think, to be honest with you, Timehi, if you hold on to the question, what is the content of the person? Whatever lane we go, there is something you cannot argue below. There's a certain thing you cannot go below. You understand? And that is that, first and foremost, what is the value of a human person? And when you embrace the value of a human person as a fundamental argument, then you defeat those people who say to you, you are any less than what you are, because already the person is also saying that you are less human than you are. So that is something which we were fortunate in our era, because we were the ones who did a lot of the work that led to the Beijing conference, which led to a massive movement in the country. We came back from Beijing, everywhere was Beijing, Beijing, Beijing. So we had already acquired the language of the global international rights movement, and we had a language with which we came into that space. And that language empowered us very much to have the conversations which we have.
Okay.
There's no amount of being different as a feminist that will reach the point where I will say you are less human than I am. I may not agree with your methods, but I will not go to that fundamental. And as long as that fundamental remains, then there's something that brings us together, and that commonality of interest that drives us into the future. And I'm saying this because, my dear, you may come across a lot of feminists that are actually very protective of every kind of shade. I wish some of you were aware of the work of someone like Bekisu. We did a lot of work with Form 1 at the time when it was clear that some of us were running in a certain direction, some of us were running in. That thing had always been there. And people said, look, allow us to run at our own space. And we go on the street from our different locations, that there was a common humanity that was driving what we were trying to attain at the end of the day. I think again it comes back to what are the fundamentals of our identity. Before you go into the struggle for power, whether it's in the domestic space or in the public space or wherever spaces you have to, what is your fundamental philosophy about the human person and what that is? If you have no interest in the dignity of the person, it doesn't matter whether they are queer, they are women, they are male, and whatever, a certain reaction and response will come with that. As for the NGO space, the shrinking of that space, where we were in we didn't have donors, we didn't know who donors were. We raised our money, we went by night bus, we did our things. We fought with men and we fought with ourselves. So it's always been there. It's just that the language is changing. And what I'm trying to do is to encourage younger people, because there are many allies really, in our case, who will support what they are doing, but our language will be very different in the way we express it.
I'm going to come back to that as we continue this conversation, but first, can I welcome Ahan Islam to give us her second spoken word piece? Hello. Thank you.
So this piece, I wrote it. I lost my mom and I was trying to rediscover my purpose, and it's one of those poems that I do hope that when you listen to, you can empower you. And also, it's in this poem that I called myself the last planet. And I do believe that anybody can be the last planet, because it's all about basking in your glory and just being in your element regardless of what your society thinks about you. So here goes the last planet. I am that planet, not Mercury, not Mars, not Venus, but the last one, the one that you never heard of, the one on days clings onto Pluto so just maybe it may have a sense of identity, trying to come out, but hiding in those words that my tongue hit that you clap to, yet somehow I hold my soul back so it doesn't pour out the truth that I am not ready to share. Yet somehow sincerity slips its way through my veins like blood unfiltered, through the pen, kissing the paper, showcasing it to the world. To most, I am an open book, yet somehow I have booked in pain while secretly smile snatches its reservation, left with no option but to share room. So wonder not, when my eyebrow shows up with the answer, and my lip shows up with the glorious curve, it is the battle of the Roman. And just like that last planet that you never heard of, I hide me in smiles, handshakes, and hugs on days all I was supposed to say words. I am not okay. But being scared that my weakness was going to show, so I asked myself, will I be motivational? Will I be inspirational? Am I even enough? On days anxiety gets the best of me, I become like a rat running from the light in the daytime, because its sight is like an original sin. So do I love or hate myself? Do I kill or chase myself? Do I acknowledge or rebuke myself? Do I carry on the cheers that the world offers, or do I open up wounds so they could see that I've been loving the roots of pain, that my smile has been a mask for make believe that I've got it all together, when in reality, I am only given last bits of my broken self to see them keep it together. You see, it took this girl 7 years to grow with a little confidence, another 3 years into a late teen, scared of height, yet about to take a flight. Another 3 years into this woman stable in the sky like an eagle, owning the terrain, becoming one with the air, finding home in a space where law of gravity still exists, yet still soaring. Like there was just another little bird in the sky that stood no chance, so I found me. And you can find you too, if only you believe and dare to make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. We have a comment. Somebody says, I really like Timayan's point. And I think that's why we're seeing more feminists arise out of other spaces outside of civil society. Hardly do we see young staff of NGOs wearing the toga of feminists. I'm going to branch us. I'm coming to ask you actually. Yes. I want to branch that question into two places. the first, or no, the second, Buki will speak to the first. I'm going to ask her to speak to the first. The second is, even in this conversation, the presence of very real harm being done within the spaces that are supposed to be safe spaces. And what is happening is just a lack of trust that the person standing beside you is not going to poison your soil. You know, even if we're all fighting for more, as you say, as you said earlier on. And I'm going to ask us to speak to that a little bit further. But before then, Buki, I want to say something to you, and I'm going to pull from something Nkoyo said in her interview with Timaine. She talks about when the movement then moved into the development space, about not being accountable to themselves anymore, but now being accountable to development partners and international donors, and having to structure narratives to fit into development discourse. In the process, losing the energy that comes from being an independent movement. How do you think that development work impacts, or being in the development space impacts or influences feminist conversations, especially when somebody thinks that many women who work in NGOs would no longer call themselves feminists?
Okay. So there's a couple of ways to answer this, and of course, there are no easy answers here. For me, I've both benefited from being in the civil society space as a feminist, and also seeing some of the things that Chioma said. But at the same time, it's also where I had some of my biggest awakening, and I think I don't know if it's luck, because I grew up in a home that had visitors from like Toyo, Cindy Medako, Sase Wava, and those were the kind of conversations I was privy to. And their feminism was pretty radical to me at the time. And the conversations they were having was pretty radical to me at the time. And so for me, within the civil society space, what I thought it actually provided was the opportunity to be able to have different kind of conversations that didn't exist outside of it. Because the truth for me is that even in the academic space in which my mom came up in, or in different spaces in Nigeria, especially coming out of like structural adjustment and the role of religion, and how religion became this thing in which it controlled even the ways we could have conversations around certain things, right? Because before then, you could at least tolerate some conversations. But with religion, and where I see it now, but you can't. And seeing it play out in a way in which people are now saying that, within civil society, I just come in to do my work, I leave it at work, and when I go home, I don't take it home, right? So for example, the young women can come in and say that, look, yes, you all are doing women's rights work, and that's beautiful, that's great, and yes, I generally support it, but when I go home, my husband is the head of this home, and he makes decisions. And if he says I can't travel, I can't travel. And if he says my kids cannot go to a certain school, I can't go to a certain school. So for me, I think we do need to be really clear about, yes, the person says that this is who they are, but at the same time, don't embody that or feel like they're just in civil society to do work and get their paycheck and go home. Because if they do anything else, they're going against their religion, they're destroying their home and things like that. I mean, then that's the reality that they live in and they exist in. And I think it's important to recognize that. So I think it's not just an issue of people within the feminist space for civil society. It's just that in general in civil society, a lot of people actually do not believe sometimes in the work that they do. They just do it because it is work. It is a job that they go to, punch in their hours, do what they're supposed to do, and go home. Yes, there's some of us who also then come in and say, like, this is what we're passionate about. and this is who we are, and we're going to bring our full selves to the work. Then the question now becomes, to bring your full self to the work, how do you ensure that you do not get swallowed up by the work? Right? And you have mental support to be able to continue to do that. Are you paid enough to be able to continue to do that? And for me, that's really important. So for me, when we're also having these conversations, I think it's quite important to then go back to the economy and talk about the fact that a lot of people start civil society organizations in Nigeria because there's no job markets in this country. And so people think that the fastest and quickest thing you can do is start an NGO, start a foundation, you know, get a couple of fellowships, get a couple of grants, and then you're moving forward. I mean, it was pretty amazing to me when I heard that that was what happened, but also just a very clear, rational decision for it to happen. So when you find people who manage to come do the work, can be professional about it, but also bring their passion, you can tell the difference and you can see the growth. Because one of the things that I think is amazing in the digital marketing organization I work on is that recently I just met two young people who had gone through Abuja. And one of them said, you know, it was the first time they got to advocate on issues that matter to them as young people. And now one of the guys has started a media company that is doing documentaries around different kind of work and telling different kind of stories. And then another young woman who now works as an investment banker, but says that some of this work that she has done is what led to her consciousness and how she even approaches the work that she does and the way she builds community. So for me, I'm like, if that's possible, then we need to continue to do that, and we need to continue to support young people to do that and encourage that and find ways to nurture that in them. Because if you're not doing that, of course they're just going to go in the direction that makes sense to their pockets, that makes sense to the existence that they find themselves in. So for me, basically, all I'm saying with all of my family is that we do need to pull back and seriously think that we cannot remove ourselves from the context in which we exist in Nigeria. This is what we have. But how do we manage to build and support young people to truly understand the value of enlightenment for everyone, even within the context of religious fundamentalism that is increasing more and more? And how do we manage to build a civil society that not just people who feel that within civil society what you're doing is civic work and building a better society for everyone, and not just for self.
One of okay.
The donor side of things, because this is all things that you said. I guess when I read that bit about how we responded, how they dealt with other things that actually made it, I thought about it in 2 ways. That one, I do think that this, as much good as donor money does, it's a double-edged sword, and I did see that loss of independence that we talked about. I do worry about it for mine, because if we talk about the real work that needs to be done to make citizens, not citizens, understand how structures, it's very low. It doesn't fit into the traditional models of giving grants for a year, giving grants for 2 years. This is work that you probably have to sustain to really get that change. So we're all at fault for not binary application in invest in the work that needs to happen.
Can you take off your mask?
So there's opportunity for us to invest properly in that type of work, and that's where I see the double-edged sword of donor money. And then the other part is the competition that was also talked about, where a small community, everybody wants to see. That's also an aspect that donors need to come together and work on, which is why when I spoke earlier, it was about collaboration. Because for us, we see, as opposed to competition, why would we see more collaboration? And in terms of talking about feminism today and patriarchy, one thing that we haven't discussed, and which is uppermost in my mind as we talk about competition, is that generally females are socialized to compete. That's my theory. I call it the fact that there's only one glass everybody's in the casting, but everybody wants to be one that ends up the casting. So there is that socialization. So again, it comes down to how do you rewire right? Mobilizing, organizing. And to be honest, the question I keep asking, can you get 1,000 people come out? So they have stayed out as that norm. So and that's also part of the military medicine. And that's also part of the past is how we commodify and recognize poverty to the point where nobody wants to speak about things that affect their skin unless they're paid to do. Because they believe some NGO somewhere being given money to do this thing. Why should I do this? So it's a really huge problem. And I think we need to look at it from all those dimensions.
This is a very valuable perspective that you both give. I'm going to skip over to the other part of that question. Nkoyi, when you talked, there's something somebody says, one of the women says in this conversation, that many times the conversation then becomes for older feminists about feeling like their experience, I don't know if I can find, but their experience and years are central to intergenerational interactions and shouldn't necessarily be contested. When you said that these things have always happened and the spaces are shrinking. And so of course, it then means the likelihood is that it will continue to happen and even more viciously. And what we are seeing is present and ongoing harm. One of the things that young people are doing then is trying to challenge how these conversations are placed in a hierarchy. Because of course, what happens as spaces shrink is that people will then decide that their issues are a bigger priority than the other person's. And I think that young people, and when I say young people, I'd like to think that, you know, but I see many people who are not necessarily activists, but who are taking the personal into the political and who are refusing to accept that this status quo should continue. We will call it what it is. And maybe we just have to agree that we will all till our own. I'm hearing a very consistent disillusionment, a very consistent hurt. Fakri, I'm coming to you. Because a lot of your work, it seems, you've often had to justify even your motives for work that has been seen to be quite beneficial to all. How do you challenge some of these hierarchies of oppression within feminist spaces? How do you persist? How do you resist?
Great question. So I think I've always seen myself as being on the sidelines, right? I've never actually felt like I was a true part of the civil society, even though a lot of the work I've done in the past years has been within the confines of that space. And I guess that has really helped slog some of the sentiments and some of the remarks that I would often get, and especially because almost everything I've done around gender-based violence or governance has focused on Northern Nigeria. So you're basically working with a lot of conservatives that do not identify as feminists, and I understand the question of language, right? You don't have to identify in a certain way to be working towards the same objective. So I always understood that because sometimes you have meetings with women from a different generation that are working around the same issues, and then they tell you blatantly that, you're radical, you're sometimes reckless with how you approach the conversation, and all of that. And to be honest, because I've always looked at myself as not really being part of that space, true and true, that I could just shrug it off and be like, okay, how can we work together despite these issues that we seem to have in place? And sometimes things work, and sometimes, the conversation just stops there. But like even with some of our campaigns that we did, it's due to this fact that, okay, we're a little bit of the outsiders, and then, all of these people within this space, they're my friends, and that has helped, right? Being able to collaborate, because every single thing we've done, we try to center other organizations around it, because then, even if I'm not well versed in the politics that goes around, word for word, I understand the politics on that goes on in the space on a broader sense, so that really be conscious of that, and knowing that if we don't find a way to bypass the politics, then we wouldn't be able to achieve any objectives, right? And understanding that yes, people should be known for the kind of work they do. So giving people the credit of the work that they do around these spaces. So I guess at many points, like me personally, I try to shrink myself because it's nothing to me, which might have some of its downsides personally, but it has always helped to sort of, put the lens, sort of project the work on others. And especially within North Momo, like the campaign where we had representatives in about 8 northern Nigerian states, it's just highlighting the work that these organizations do that are not really part of the Abuja, Lagos, CSO space, right? But it goes a long way to fishing these people out and, always connecting the kind of work they do and giving them the kind of credits that others may not, because they do not get funding directly from, the multilateral donors. Someone gets the funding and then goes and then partners with them, and in many cases you have to fish them out because their names are not there. It's not readily available. Like the CSO spaces around the states are very much fragmented due to many issues. Capacity being one of those. But really, it's just really about understanding that you're not going to be on the same side with, like most people will not even like you, to be honest. That's my personal experience. But it's about having to push that aside and focus on the larger objective, which is different than all of us put together, like some of these issues that we face. So yeah, I mean, that has been my personal experience. Yeah, thank you for asking.
Thank you for sharing. You said something that made me think about something that Elspeth Engelbert talks about. She talks about going to do some work around land use struggles in South Africa. And the people who were dealing with land theft or the land issues were Black women. But when they were having the conversations, the people who were having the conversations were white women, because the Black women were in the kitchen, serving and so on. So there were white women speaking on behalf of the people who actually had the need for these interventions and for their stories to be told. And it made me think about the accessibility often of the work that is done. You said something about language, and even in your speaking for Korea, you're also talking about stepping outside, that there are many times that the people you interact with are not really in that space, or you even are not really in that space. I'm curious about how much, I'm going to again, ask two questions. But the first question is, I'm curious about how much accommodation we make for people who have fundamentally, either in rural areas, in community organizing, done work that by its definition is strongly feminist, but whose language or whose lack of access means that their voices are not heard. Do you feel like we are seeing, do we feel like we're doing enough to, and I don't even want to say accommodate, because then it seems like we're giving them something that should be theirs. Are we doing enough to acknowledge and to respect and to value the perspectives of people who might not have our language, but whose ideologies, whose work is aligned with ours?
Can I, the answer that I have inside me to this question is very big, so give me a bit of space, please. The question of language, I think, is seductive because it gives us room to quibble and imagine that we're doing productive work, right? So I like to think about work in terms of what people need before getting to the point of how you describe that. I was listening to Aisha's point about the commodification of mobilization and how maybe people wouldn't have shown up for NSAS if there hadn't been food. People need food. I don't know. The t-shirt thing, yes. The transport money thing, definitely. But part of the fuel for those protests was hunger. And hunger in the midst of plenty. And there was a fundamental recognition that human beings are self-interested and our strongest instinct is to survive. So if you want somebody to come and fight in a self-interested way, you have to make sure that they understand you are interested in their survival. I don't think that's commodification. I think it's an understanding of the basic principles of life. And if you take that framework of recognizing need over language and over social position or social location, then the differences that feminists like to imagine exist between and among us start to melt away. Because the point you made earlier about common causes is entirely valid. We're all fighting for the same thing: bodily autonomy, freedom from violence, access to resources, the protection of our rights. It doesn't go beyond. But when we start to think about language and we start to talk about intersections and identity, and are we addressing people's needs? Is that what our work does? So people who aren't getting recognition in civil society spaces because we're thinking about, do they have access? Do they have language? The people who have power within civil society spaces, if they started to think about it in terms of, are people addressing their needs? And are we resourcing people to address their needs? The question of language becomes almost irrelevant. And I think that's the most effective way to do social transformation work. But that way of doing work requires us to divest from patterns of power holding that we don't even question. It's easy to talk about the ways that people seek power, but the more invisible thing is the ways that we are accustomed to using power and inhabiting spaces of authority. So feminist organizations or feminist space and civil society space does this thing with the roundtables and the dialogues. Are we having the right conversations? Are people's needs being met? We can have conversations from morning till night. Are people's needs being met? Are people being resourced to meet their needs? People will develop language when their needs have been met. And you will understand what they're saying because their needs have been met. So is my need for safety as a human being met in the work that I'm doing alongside people? Is my need for resources being met? Is my need for dignity being met? Is my need for connection being met? We can talk about language after, but the fractures that exist in civil society space come from these questions. And I know that the question of donor funding is really fraught and legitimately so. But the thing is that if you reframe or at least since I reframe the conversation in this way, it has become abundantly clear that on Okonjo-Iweala, there are many ways to achieve the same thing. WIN was receiving funding before they started getting donor funding, right? But now we have a civil society space where the imagination around resources is very limited. It's not that the space has shrunk, it's that our imaginations have shrunk. I was working with people doing urban poverty work in Lagos, and people were mobilizing to meet their needs outside of funding, outside of civil society. And then when organizations came in to resource the work that they were already doing to meet their needs, it didn't matter what language we were speaking. It didn't matter how we identified. It didn't matter. It was just, there are needs that must be met, and here are resources to do that work. So if we spend time talking about the way we talk about the work, I think that that's less effective than rejigging how we think about the work. And it feels like civil society and feminist organizations are very much starting in the middle more than they're starting at the beginning. Are people's needs being met? Or, well, for some feminists, are people first? Then when you answer the question, is this a person? Then you can arrive at, is this person's need being met? But yeah.
Yes.
I want to jump in about the funding thing, and I think that's probably why I don't like answering this question, because I just think the truth of the matter is that, one, we fundamentally don't want to talk about how capitalists have behaviors are. We just don't. Because even the issue of visibility, it's very much heteropatriarchal capitalist behavior. Because the thing about making sure like 30 over 30, 40 under 40, 2 over 3, all of these things is very much pitting people against each other. And funding that, or saying that, I can only recognize 2 people to come to the table, or things like that. And we accept it instead of pushing back against it and saying that we're civil society, we don't have to accept it. And I think it's true, because one of the things that I saw happen, and we can talk about all of the issues that we're facing, but for example, when Trump came into power, and the US brought back the Helms rule, the global gap rule, which is saying that they won't fund organizations to carry out safe abortion. Even if you're using your own money, they still would not give you money at all. And there were still women's rights groups who refused out of principle to sign, right? And put their principles first. And I think we often don't talk about those organizations because they don't seek recognition. They don't see it as fundamental to their work because they are divesting from this capitalist understanding of success and this capitalist understanding of what matters, right? Or what even the needs are. Because they're about building community. And they're feminist funders who are doing that. So when donors come to me and ask me questions like, how do we fund? How do we find? I'm like, go to feminist donors. They've been doing it for years. And they know how to fund groups that are not even registered. Do you understand? They know how to fund groups that are individuals. They know how to fund, feminists who are doing work around restorative justice in their communities that does not rely on policing, that does not rely on criminalization. Because one of the things that we also take for granted within our feminist legacy is that there is research and documentation. Yes, I know that we say that there's not enough, but things like perspectives, feminist Africa, and those conversations show that there's been this different kind of talk, it's not new. It's just that we're not willing to divest from capitalism.
Can I just add one thing? Because I just remembered.
One second, are you done?
Let me just
Okay, let her finish. Let her finish.
We're not ready to divest from capitalism, and we are continuing to, subscribe to that and to donors being willing to do that. Because I think now that we're actually forcing donors to talk about power, and we're forcing donors to actually, come to the table with a little bit more than money, then all of the conversation becomes a little different. Because when you're now doing the work, they are willing to come to you to have those kind of conversations. I'm not saying it's perfect, I'm not saying it's kumbaya, but I just feel like those are the kind of conversations that we need to be having and to continue having, because it is happening. And we should not expect certain foundations or expect certain big donors to be able to do that, even embassies, for example, or anything, because there's reasons why they're giving you that money. It's not gonna change. So, what exactly do you want to do? Are we going to divest from it so that we can actually build the movements that we want and have the conversations that we want to do? Because if that's what we want to do, then we can do it. It's happening already.
Okay. Just one sentence about what Fakria said, because it really struck me when she said that she's been called reckless. Because if you think about what recklessness means, it's an invocation to be careful. And why are you asking somebody to protect a system that you're supposed to be divesting from? Because the recklessness is you're moving in a way that will destroy everything. But we're inside a system that is killing and maiming and violating and traumatizing women and children. Why are you asking people to be careful? Is it in the interest of the women and children who are being harmed, because there is a degree of care that is absolutely necessary in that regard, or in the interest of maintaining the status quo so that you can continue to have a living? Because that's a conversation that doesn't happen enough in civil society space. Your job comes from the oppression that you fight. That's a clear conflict of interest right there. And the more time people spend in civil society space, the more comfortable they are with getting a paycheck from the thing that they resist, is what I've observed. So people saying, oh, don't be reckless. It's like, don't burn it down, because I live inside that house too. Even though I'm on the porch, because I'm saying I don't like the house, I still live inside that house. The invocation for care in service of the system is very telling. If what we're prioritizing is women, if what we're prioritizing is freedom from violence, then there are certain things that we should be comfortable, or maybe not comfortable, but willing to begin to release. Because if we're saying we want to change the system, then we have to let the system go.
I'm going to throw this out again. I just have like a couple more questions, two more, this and one more, and then I think we can round up. I'm hearing this and I'm thinking about how this manifests in our everyday. Does anybody have for me any perspectives on first what we're talking about, but also how you experience feminism? I'm trying to frame this coherently. Timmy makes an excellent point about our needs being met. If we talk about meeting needs, we'll find out that language is not such a big deal. We are currently in a place where language is a big deal. And we're not yet at a point where we're thinking about our needs being met. But what's happening is that many people then who would be interested in the conversation as an identity, a personal identity in my media work. How am I feminist? How am I doing work within my space that makes the people around me safe? You know? In terms of your personal experiences, how do you see this situation between language and the meeting of needs? Would anybody like to speak? Dorothy. Especially because for you, your work is both deeply personal and then, you know, very, very many layers to your work.
However, and so they struggling with being respected? Are they struggling with, being heard? When they say, I feel offended by this person, and you're expected to keep quiet so that the man's ego is massaged. So sometimes a lot of things, we're talking largely about consent, and it's a problem even in the rural environment. But with regard to consent, we find a very technical terminology. What is consent in the different local dialects in Nigeria? If maybe we started thinking along those lines, then more people will say, oh, this is how I can relate to this is how I can relate. So, opening conversations and expanding conversations to help more people tell the stories in their own languages, will show us so many times that a lot of times what we think we want to launch out and poetry, just all these beings of still what is happening elsewhere.
Absolutely. You make such a good point that many times we go in, I think, with the savior mentality. I'm here to help you. As opposed to, I'm here to teach you, how to make your life better. As opposed to,
Even in the teaching, for instance, a lot of people tell me, even within this space, that the things you have seen have damaged you very much. So let us help you and think through things. Let's help you and I'm telling you, this is exactly how I feel now. This is where I need help. And you're telling me that you're too damaged by your experiences and what you expose yourself to. So it's still that's creating the space for everybody's voice to count. So many people are ashamed of what they have to say because it doesn't sound like a popular language. So do we have enough spaces where, irrespective of your language, your experiences count?
we have there are some points that have come in from online, and I want to share them. I don't know that we have answers, but it's good to include in the conversation. Lizzie Bine says, on feminism and gender violence, we're missing out the harassment, raping, and killing of women farmers in their farms in Nigeria. We're collecting data, but we want to raise the voices of women farmers in Nigeria because, of course, we can talk about farmers and their livestock and their crops being damaged. But when you talk about a female farmer, that conversation then gets several more layers of danger, damage that we have to think about. Eka Williams says, there's more that unites Nigerian feminists than divides them. How can we build on what unites us? I don't know that that's a question that has easy answers, but I'd like us to keep that as well in mind. I want us to close with a reflection on something that somebody called Bernadette Muthien talks about, recentering the indigenous matricentric in Africa. And she talks about generally a complete divesting, which I'm hearing in various ways, of the systems, not just patriarchy as a concept, but the systems that patriarchy enables. And she talks about coming home to the ways, decolonizing our relationship with feminism, decolonizing the way that we work, not necessarily because there was no patriarchy pre-colonial times, but because women's voices were more, we have very many, matrilineal systems, ways of working and so on. My optimism is still very crushed. Everything I have heard here, tells me that we could have this conversation for 3 hours and still stand the present and the things that we're experiencing. But if we could each take a minute to talk about what bringing it back home, she calls it the rematriation, in this space. If we could talk about what that would look like for us, I think that it would be a good way to round up this conversation. Would you like to say something? I'm going to come back to you, so that you can, I know you weren't expecting that. Would you like to start? If we could talk about bringing this conversation back home, about engaging, existing as a woman, as a feminist, in a way that is safe for you, in a way that honors. I shrink from how sometimes expressing the feminine as a space that is always soft and kind, because it is not, and it should not be. But if there is a way in that represents safety for you, and that might be in your work, that might be in your person, that might be in your country and your experience of community, what would that look like? What does that look like for you? What's one thing that would happen that you would be like, this world is changing and becoming a better place?
I feel safe and having people work together, living together, because I feel that there's if all people are together, things will achieve more. As women, as parents, and we get to.
Of course, it's your answer. Yes.
For me, I just feel that we work more together, we'll be able to achieve more.
Dorothy?
So there's scarce resources, and a lot of people have been socialized into thinking harmful ideologies, all sorts of harmful ideologies, right? And so I would say, wow. So there's something that happens in those people, right? When I come out and I introduce myself as an abuse survivor, a lot of people look at me and say, "Are you okay?" And then when I talk about how many times, or average of how many times, for instance, I have been raped, a lot of people are like, "You well." You know, but after that, a lot of people come out and say, "Thank you for giving validity to my feelings. Thank you for giving this." So more and more investment in helping feminists amplify feminism. And it's not about, okay, this is a non-feminist. There's so many people who need more help. So how can we amplify the realities? Pre-COVID, response to LGBT looks like workshops, seminars, trips to different places and events. But when the reality of femicides during COVID linked to LGBT came, then there was a knowledge of the fact that there are really human beings that should benefit from response to LGBT. But now, with normalization, I'm looking more at when you're saying response to LGBT, we're struggling with coming to terms with the speed of technology, right? We don't define robots. What's the welfare of the people who you are deploying to do that? So the conversations are expanding more and more. And that's a good because more people are not doing it. So we need more resources in these spaces to expand those stories and give more people validity. A lot of people on the internet and they just do random search for what is on their mind. So if what was on their mind was related to the feminist issue, how many days do they say that's to their end? So this is the first one.
If I just take it where she starts, and let's say that as much as it's difficult, we've established that it's difficult to work together because we have different strands of understanding, right, of what feminism is. Coming in here, my thought was hopefully we're going to arrive at a common definition of feminism. Having said that, instead I'm more reminded of how important my work is and the power and the responsibility that the work that I do has. And I've also seen the harms that the donor community, without really feel, you can actually also bring it to the space. All that. this. I think what I'm going to do is kind of a reminder of what I can say that I already practice. It is understanding that everyone has different sense of mouth, just because they should be able to use it. And also that I kind of disagree that language doesn't matter. I think language does matter. And approaching that statement that I just made from the point of humility, understanding that I'm accepting that and having the humility to acknowledge that everybody's language, everybody's needs, everybody's mode of expression is valid to help us to probably accommodate everyone and also center what is most important. You know, feminism, I was hoping that you say it is an important thing. Because that's the one thing that we can all rally around and forget about the different entry points, the different reasons why we're coming into the space, and the different reasons why we can't collaborate. She heard me, she said, all those things are human things, I think, and not necessarily women things, or things that are targeted at bringing down feminism. So I guess a little bit more humility from everyone coming into the conversation, coming into the space to work, but also the point that she made about centering what is the most important, not myself, right? The issues. The fact that if I pull out of this conversation because I'm being hurt several lives, I can take care of myself. I say that all the time. When we talk about gender, inequalities and all that, I know how to hold my own space, how to voice. But if I don't use my voice when I should, then there are several people that we just talk about in communities that will not get, have the access, have all of these things. So maybe we can think about them a little bit more when we are approaching, these discourses. And when we're thinking of putting out or creating different things, of course we will arrive at the same, hopefully we will arrive at our destination. But perhaps we can think about sharing all of those things. I want to set us the progress. One thing that came out, and we talked about it a lot, was that, oh my God, how did they do this? Right? It was because, I guess, everyone was talking about one thing. There were several people, Muslims, all the people talk about religion, being impediments, about different practices and beliefs. But at that time, in those weeks, the only thing that mattered was getting answers out of the way. And I think if we can do that, then hopefully these conversations can be more meaningful and we can keep up hope alive, right?
Okay.
Don't fret just yet. So that's what I'm going to say. I'm thank you for very rich and insightful conversations.
Shani?
Okay. The question was what
what coming back, what returning it to ourselves looks like.
Okay. For me, it's less about safety than about being affirmed. What I do and what I think is important. And my work really is about trying to produce knowledge that makes think, not only to think, but to act and to be in ways that do not accept received notions of how one should be, what one should do, what one should think, and so on, which are things we are called exploitative in so many different ways. So part of that is taken the form of the past teaching, but currently writing, editing, and that sort of work. So, and I'm trying to do more of that now, but what can do this, but it's often very isolated work. So even when you're connected with other people in different institutions, so on, often you're active. I'm at my desk, facing my computer, thinking now, but yes, I feel that. So what keeps me going is when I have someone telling me, like yesterday, someone who was a student when I was there, he was saying, well, you don't remember this, but you make a big difference, you know? And you help me to think critically and start questioning things. That's wonderful. I never would have thought that, known that, you have said it, and you have been in a place where that's possible. So things like that, somebody say something I wrote, and they say that it makes a mistake or made a difference.
First of all, thank you so much. Thank you for this conversation. Listening to them. So I guess to answer your question, one thing I want to go back to is what I mentioned earlier about competition, right? If we are naturally predisposed to compete with one another, yes, it can't be entirely that, right? So, can sort of rewire how we compete within the CSO space, right? I feel like if these activists, clusters, or these tech movers can innovate and compete through innovating, then why can't we in the sector? And even with that, compete with the content, right? But I guess that brings up the question of the knowledge gap that usually exists within the community that has the resources that they sell to, groups and organizations within the space. The knowledge gaps prevent that kind of healthy competition. So if we're able to close those gaps and we're able to sort of foster the taking of ideas and how we can innovate out of the issues that we face today, wouldn't that make the space a better place? Wouldn't that sort of foster a healthier growth of the space and even prevent government stamping, trying to close out the space and push as many people out? And we're seeing it today. A lot of us are leaving, and that is just one way the government is shrinking that space. It's not just the brain drain that is going around in these globally competitive sectors. It's the civil society space. A lot of people are being terrorized into leaving. A lot of people are being feel disadvantaged, right? So you are within this space and it's becoming unhealthy for you, especially as women, because when the space keeps on shrinking, women have I do believe women are more disadvantaged because at the end of the day, we're having to leave this space to more men, if I may, that are able to battle, the power out of it, and women are able to just resign. So I guess, just how can we foster healthy competition that is based on competitive ideas that allows the resources to flow in the right direction? So I guess that's what I want to say.
I think mine is just about grace, and people just giving each other grace. And I think it's largely because the work that everyone does is hard, but particularly if you're speaking of or you're trying to make the path easier for people who have to navigate violence. especially where they almost have to navigate this violence like every day. The work is hard, it's draining, and all of those things. So something that would be, if I pick the part of the question I had to do, what like this year or what would bring it back, right? I think it's just giving grace, and it's not just giving grace to people on the outside, because something I've seen is, and I'm happy, Koyo and Time talked about different types of feminism as it were. So sometimes, especially on social media, you see someone say something, and because it doesn't fit the mold of the feminism that you know, or the feminism that you practice, the person's counsel, it's like, God, need that kind of thing. So for me, I always think there's a grace that needs to be given there. There's always a grace that needs to be given there. And then when you come into like the smaller circles, I think, there's a bunch of people who have been fighting these fights for a while, and then we all go into realizing, oh, by the way, as a woman, you have to be struggling for one thing or the other. So you come in and you meet your mothers and your elder sisters fighting for something. There's also a grace that I'm learning that, young people need to give older people, almost like you've been here for a bit. And I see you and I see your work. Older people also need to give young people that, because circumstances are different. Things have become maybe tougher things, and the same way they might have felt overwhelmed in their times, the way we feel overwhelmed now, everyone just literally trying to make it to the next day. So yeah, there's a lot of grace for me that just needs to be given all around, for people to make mistakes, for people to prioritize the things that matter to them, and not jump on their own bandwagon because that's what matters to them. I want to fight, I will fight good, and if I have some space to come work with you, then I will. So for me, I think it's just grace. It's a lot more grace.
Checks.
Yeah. For me, it would be a couple of things. Maybe empathy. Empathy with reality. Understanding that, I feel like the person. That's the first thing. The other one is to continue to challenge myths and perceptions and beliefs about how we do things. To help people understand that really, I don't think we can use an access to dismantle function. We need to do attention and to make theory.
Okay.
I think there's a couple of things. One, I think it's hard for me to shape my understanding of that my liberation is connected to the liberation of others. And so it doesn't matter what their shackles look like, I am there to support and ensure that they can break them. Because them fighting theirs also helps me break up mine. So it's hard. I know seeing your link thing, for me, I think I find it difficult. Because I really just feel that fighting and pushing towards liberation is just a community effort. It's based on all of us seeing each other, recognizing each other, and recognizing the ways in which oppression comes for us in so many different ways. So, I might not be going through that, but like that oppression is coming for both of us. It is waiting for both of us in many ways to continue to fight against each other. So for me, coming to myself means always recognizing where the oppression is coming from, recognizing how I can link to each other, which is why no matter how difficult people tell me partnerships and collaborations are, I will always do it. Always, even when it looks stupid, I will do it. Because I feel like until we keep doing that, things are not going to change. So that for me is the coming back to self. There's another thing I want to learn how to do better, which is this whole understanding, and Loretta Ross wrote about it, the calling in, calling out model of engagement. And there's the
don't go on Twitter, who also wrote about it, that no matter how mad a feminist is moving on social media, I am not going to, necessarily call her out in a way that continues to perpetuate this understanding of women as enemies of each other, or perpetuates the way patriarchy continues to divide us. If I am in community with her, I will reach out to her and be like, can we have a conversation? So that it is made with, even if it's made with anger and pain, but that conversation could possibly be had. And when I'm not in community with that person, I wouldn't look. As long as she's not harming somebody else, I might reach out to somebody who she's in community with and be like, look, I think you should have a conversation with this person. Because there's something to be said, and I think you mentioned it, and I think Lawrence Ross also mentioned it, in saying that, look, if at the end of the day, I realize that we might not have the same language, we might not have the same tools, we might not have the same understanding, but we're moving in a direction that could help each other, and that maybe right at this moment you don't understand. Because that's where I'm coming from. I came from a very different background of not understanding many things, of not understanding queerness, of not understanding the ways people should be free, of not understanding that someone's freedom doesn't take away from mine, that discomfort is a reality. And now I'm able to move into a space where I can do that, where I can feel that. So is it possible for me to create space for somebody to move towards that as well? Don't I, of course, without making the space harmful and supporting toxicity and supporting, hurting people for who they are or making them feel less than, or not seeing the values as human, but is there a way to create a space so that we can be the one engaging in a space where they too can see their freedom as living freedom of purpose we may never have seen. So that's what it means to come back to something.
I want to thank everyone for the really different contributions made. Unfortunately for us today, we started this history at the point of the military at 1999. I hope that in future, we will really go back and read the histories of what women before us have done. We will find out that we're speaking to ourselves again and again, but in different contexts. I don't know her name quite. Talked about where she goes to meetings and people say you're too radical, that they use a certain type of label on you to try and get you to be outside the kind of conversations they're having. That happened to us. That happened to us. I was stopped from going to Beijing because we were some of the women who were standing up against the Abuja government, and the return of where we thought we had reached as women who were more radical in our understanding of where feminism should be, we felt that it was bad enough to have better life, which sort of instrumentalization of the liberation of women from the grassroots into the mainstream, and they were used towards a certain end. That was our interpretation. But today I have better understanding, and I will tell you, Jimmy, that what people like Mary and Babangida did was to bring out women who would never have even understood the conversations. When they went back, did they interpret what they heard and did in a different way? Did they challenge where they found themselves, where they were in society? Takes us back to the economic reality. Mary and Babangida spoke the language of needs on the better life, even the language, better life for rural women. Spoke to needs. But we, in our own understanding of our own feminism in Queen, and incidentally, I have to read what Eka, who was one of the very, towards the early 90s, was the national coordinator of women at the time. She left a message here for me to share. She's in the US right now, but she's joined us on this platform. So these stories we are telling have always been with us. I was just reading a section on Fumilayo and Samputi in one of the
articles
When the Mario and Babangida were doing rural women, he said, look, oh, you people are just using it to give more power to your husbands. You just want to take their voices. Then listen, she brought out women. For the first time, women started hearing things like better life. If we have a life of our own. And these were women in very many locations in life. Some had never had these conversations before with themselves. How she used it is a different question. But how it manifested itself in many spaces across the country is also a conversation we need to have, and maybe the academics need to go back and look at that literature. But if you look at the work of people like Mama and Amina Mama on democracy, you will see that we also interrogated that space. And we felt like we had the better understanding of what being a feminist was. But the difference, probably the difference I may add in that conversation is that as much as we stayed on our lane, we interrogated them, we challenged them, we didn't allow them to think they could get away with it. That is why people who were even like me were denied, refused. I got to the airport and I was stopped from going to the gym. Because these are things that we ourselves spoke out publicly against. So, this question of needs has always been a part of the conversation. What Charmaine has raised is about neoliberalism that even takes away that needs, reinterprets it, keeps you in a certain location, class location in society, and that's where we started from. We started from challenging those class questions. Why are women and certain people in a certain location in life? And how can we talk about that location as though that location is not nuanced, and that even in that location of the poor, women are even poorer than the men? Those were some of the conversations we had. These histories have to be brought back for younger people to see where they can learn from, and for us to learn from you. It's a two-way track for us to learn from you. So the meeting you went to, and people say that we did it, we had it. We were even watched when we went to meetings to find out whether we go there and criticize the programs of government because we are calling them names and calling them out for what they do. So at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that we need to go back to those histories. I think Aisha mentioned it. Let's put those issues back into the context of what the now feminists are talking about. There is a lot of connections and threads inside it. Okay. And we need to keep, just the last one, let me relay past comment which she shared with us, because she'll be online.
Okay, is it, because we have about 5 minutes. Okay, okay.
Says it's not only about meeting needs, the environment and space are not conducive to do feminist work, even when resources may exist. So you have to challenge, you have to continue to challenge that system going forward. And it's that challenge that brings us back to spaces where we can have more. Even within the women's group as well, that challenge needs to continue to go forward. Thank you.
Well, for me, the thing that brings it home is turning my politics inward. So I'm a feminist because I believe that people's humanity is not contestable. And my biggest priority as a feminist is making sure that I live out that belief. I think it would make my life easier, to use your language, if it became common practice for feminists to take their feminism out of the abstract and into material reality. So if you really think through this world that you're imagining, if you really follow the fights that you have chosen to their logical conclusion, what does that world look like? Who is safe in that world? Who has resources in that world? Who has been left behind? If these questions were more honestly and more rigorously answered, I think that a lot of the conflict that exists in feminist spaces might dissipate, because the people who are left out of other people's feminist practice can see it. I can see the gaps in your priorities. But if you don't see those gaps, then you don't see the value of my work that fills those gaps, right? So if we take our feminist practice out of the realm of objectives and grant making proposals and into just how am I living this out in reality, and what does the world that I'm living for actually look like? Have I ended patriarchy, or have I just shifted it to better accommodate me? And it shows up every day in the way that you interact with the people that you have patriarchal power over, because patriarchal power isn't just gendered, it's also classed. It's also, it's about supremacy, having the possibility as a human being to stand in a position of superiority to someone else. So in every interaction that you have, where there's an opportunity to show or assert dominance or to assume superiority, are you living anti-patriarchally, or is that just your job? Taking feminism out of the abstract and making it a practice that I embody in every interaction reminds me that my first responsibility as a feminist is to myself and the people who actually engage with me. Everything else that I say is theory. What is my practice?
Thank you. I don't think we'll ever get a single answer to him. Yeah, I don't think we'll get a single answer for feminism, but maybe that's a good place to start from, that it cannot be a single answer. And maybe in our work, we can recognize that I do not get to define what your feminism looks like or should look like. And I do not get to restrict based on the inconveniences, in quote, of your feminism, I think. I think that I came here with lots of questions, and I came here hoping for answers, but maybe a good place to start is that these questions exist. And if we can put these questions and these hurts and this grief and this, all of this, and lay it out, then maybe in 20 years, we won't be sitting in a room with feminists who are looking at us and saying, what did you do to make it safe for me? So I think as somebody whose work is about telling stories and hearing stories and amplifying stories, that I'm challenged again to ask myself if I'm only listening to the stories of those who have the right stories. If I am making space for your story, or if I'm acknowledging that you have as much right as me to tell your stories. And so maybe the questions, I think, are a good place to start. You know, I think that this has been it's been a difficult conversation in some circumstances, but I think it was necessary. And I'm glad that we did not whitewash. I'm glad that we did not, try to make it pretty, because it's not. So thank you very much for speaking and for listening. I'm going to hand over to Shema so that she can give us our vote of thanks and we can round off the evening.
Thank you, Iris. Thank you so much for moderating this session. Thank you for honest conversations. Thank you, Aisha, for taking the time to talk and sharing your own perspective. Thank you, Buki. I know you have a busy schedule and she's doing work on Secure Nigeria and Secure Our Lives, and they're all doing work and they took time out. They have a big event tomorrow, took time out to come have this difficult conversation with us. Thank you, Buki. Incredible journey from political office, government in Australia.
So I know how to find myself as a woman.
Yeah, so talking about building partnerships and collaboration, we still need to put all our energy behind her and her work and even make it loud. We're not saying she's going to win, we're not saying we have the silver bullet to win first election, but we need to put it out there and everybody knows that yes, we're here. Thank you, Olutime, for taking the time. Thank you for honest conversations. It was really good talking with you all. Thank you, Chioma. Thank you, Fakria. Thank you, Charmaine, Tony, Dorothy, Philomena, for taking time and staying with us for Philemon, sorry. And everybody else who's left and our online partners and participants who stayed to the very end. Thank you so much. I think at the end of the day for us at HBS, it's how do we strengthen our partnerships as women and feminists? How do we build platforms outside of existing structures? Because from what we are saying, some structures aren't just working for us right now. Structures that exist within politics, within economics, even within microfinancing, microcredit facilities for women, they're not working for us. So we now need to start to rethink politics and rethink systems and rethink innovation within our space and for us as feminist partners. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for taking the lead on this. Yoko has been in perspectives in South Africa for 10 years, right? We started work in Nigeria last year in 2020. He's the head of office, and this was scary for us. This is our first big outing, and it was quite lovely. And thank you all for making this conversation happen. And I think at the end of the day, we really want this conversation to continue. Oh yeah, we have a few donors in the house. Thank you for sharing your perspectives on the donor angle. So I'm not going to say what donors are doing or where we are going with our work or telling you what we want to fund. But really want to hear what you have in mind. We want to hear what way you are going to with your work as organizations and as individuals, and see how we can partner. And tell we can partner with the work. Thank you all so much. And if I forget your name, don't judge my heart, judge my head. I really appreciate all your work and I appreciate your support. Let's take time to talk before we go. We have refreshments downstairs on our way out. And have a good evening, everyone.
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you.